Hi, welcome. This is Inside Without Now. This is Inside Without Now. It's a regular live brought to you by volunteers with the Refuse Fascism movement, refusefascism.org. Hi, I'm Sam. I'm one of those volunteers. Refuse Fascism is a movement of people coming from diverse perspectives, united in the recognition that the Trump-Pence regime poses catastrophic danger to all of humanity and the planet itself, and that it must be driven from power through sustained mass nonviolent protests. And in the midst of COVID-19, we aren't calling for people to be in the streets in their millions right at this moment, but we are saying that sustained mass protest is nonviolent protest is what it's going to take to remove this regime. And tonight we are going to be joined by Sarah Roark and Coco from the refusefascism.org editorial board to get into this American fascism. I'm hoping that people are sharing this live, posting it to their personal pages, sharing it to their chapter pages, tagging their friends, family, neighbors in the comments, letting us know in the comments what your questions are, what you've been thinking about in terms of this American fascism, and very importantly, hosting watch parties in groups that you're part of. It's one of the best ways to build an audience. And while you're building that audience and bringing your friends and loved ones into this conversation, I just want to share with you a few updates, few things that have happened in basically the past day or so, all that show the advancing of the fascist program, which isn't stopping during this COVID-19 pandemic. The Justice Department dropped its prosecution of Michael Flynn, who pleaded guilty in 2017 to lying to FBI agents about his conversations with a Russian diplomat in the weeks before Trump's inauguration. The DOJ said in its filing that it made its decision after a considered review of all the facts and circumstances in the case, including newly discovered and disclosed information. The familiar stench here, as I think Coco tweeted, is the stench of fascism, which is not stopping. This regime is moving ahead with their agenda, which requires the shredding of norms, tearing up the rule of law, and destroying checks and balances in order to cement the future they want. And to take a moment to talk about Bill Barr, he's part of this fascist united front of the Trump-Pence regime, a dangerous Christian theocrat with a nightmare vision for society. And he is charged with hammering that vision into place. And that is why our conversation tonight about why there can be no more fascism denial is so important. It's time to confront it and stop it. Welcome to everybody who's joining. This is Inside Without Now. It's a regular live brought to you by Refuse Fascism so that you can stay connected to the needs and interests of all of humanity and the movement to drive out this fascist regime. Speaking of the Christian fascist element, I'm not sure if people saw, but Pence today, when he was in Iowa, where meatpacking plants are heavily infected, people are getting so sick, and they're opening up again, they're reopening. Mike Pence spoke to a group of faith leaders about the importance of resuming religious services, saying the cancellations in the name of slowing the spread of the coronavirus have, quote, been a burden for congregants. This anti-science fascist regime is more dangerous than ever and needs to be driven from power. So please continue to invite your friends to be part of this. And last one, the Trump administration refused to issue CDC guidelines drafted to give states and business owners detailed instructions on how to safely reopen amid the coronavirus pandemic. calling the guidance, quote, overly prescriptive. The 17-page report titled Guidance for Implementing the Opening Up America Again Framework was researched and written to help people, giving them detailed advice for making site-specific decisions related to opening places like schools and summer camps, daycare centers, churches, other institutions. It was supposed to be published last Friday, but agency scientists were told the guidance would never see the light of day because the Trump administration had already made clear that states should open in a safe and responsible way. Several states, meanwhile, with the president's green light and encouragement, have already moved ahead with reopening despite not meeting the threshold criteria set in previously issued reopening guidelines, which call for a 2-week downward trajectory in cases within a 14-day period. So I just wanted to give a little bit of an update before I welcome our guests for this Inside with Out Now. I am so excited to be with my dear friends Coco and Sarah Roark. They are members of the Refuse-Fascism Editorial Board, refusefascism.org, and they are going to be talking with us about this American fascism. In our statement of conscience and call to act, it states, we must say out loud what is too often spoken in whispers and riddles. An American fascism is here and advancing, wrapped in the flag and Mike Pence's Bible taken literally, spreading its poison of white supremacy, misogyny, xenophobia, and oppressive fundamentalist traditional values. So I want to open them to talk about this American fascism. And as I hand it over to them, I want to also let you know about an article that they have up on refusefascism.org that I encourage you after this live to read, to study, to discuss. It's titled As Death Toll Rises, Our Central Unskippable First Order Demand, Trump Pence Out Now. You can find that on refusefascism.org. Welcome, Sarah. Welcome, Coco.
Thank you. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you so much. And I want to give a shout out to the volunteers in Philly that blocked some of these Reopen America thugs today. And, you know, this is where a lot of this, right now, this is a hot point where this fascism is being concentrated in these Reopen America rallies, which are backed by these very powerful fascist forces and are, you know, there was an article that said this is genocide by default, but, you know, they are actually advocating for mass death. They know fully well who is most at risk of dying, of getting this disease and dying from it, and they don't care. You know, that's the epitome of the me first, white supremacy. There's just a lot of ugly fascism that is wrapped up in these Reopen rallies. So I hope Samantha will talk a little bit more about that and check out the Twitter feed for more of those scenes today, because it's really important to oppose this. And I'm always happy to talk to my friend Sarah and my friend and writing partner, Sarah. So welcome, Sarah, and it's nice to see you. And welcome to everybody. I hope a lot of people are sharing and watching this. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the article that we wrote and this one paragraph that I think is really important. And what we were doing in this article was re-emphasizing the importance, even as this death toll is rising to like just unbelievable numbers, the importance of our central demand, Trump Pence out now. The Trump Pence regime must go. That is the most realistic and really the only way of actually removing and stopping this fascist movement. You have to get these, the leaders of the movement off, get their hands off of all of the state apparatuses, off the nuclear trigger. they are able to make incredible leaps, even with the movement in the streets, through being in the White House and having access to every single branch of government, right? So this one paragraph I think is really crucial, because obviously right now we're not organizing for mass protest in the streets because of the pandemic. But we are actively working on reaching the millions of people who must join us in raising this demand and creating a political crisis that drives this regime out of power. But at minimum, we have to create the greater public consciousness that at this moment, the Trump-Pence regime is a connecting factor of all our travails. And we have to get people to understand that it is actually a fascist regime that is the connecting factor. And there's something here that I thought was interesting, that it's not that every single person who joins us and sees the danger of this regime has to understand it as fascism, but you need a minimum, a certain quorum of people, a critical mass of people within the movement who really understand, or not within the movement, but in society, who really understand that this is fascism and that it cannot be resolved through the normal channels. I wanted to ask you, Sarah, a question that I heard Sam ask to Lucia Truscott, which was a really interesting interview on Wednesday. And he said that it took him a while to understand this or see this as fascism, but now he sees it in technicolor, which I thought was a really great way of putting it. And Sam, you asked him, what was it that brought you to that realization? So I was wondering, Sarah, you've been involved in this movement for a while with me. Was there an aha moment for you? What was it that you recognized early on that you thought this is not a normal pendulum swing? There's something different happening here.
Okay, is my mic on?
Yeah.
Well, I'll give you mine if you'll give us yours. But
Okay.
there was kind of two moments, and one of them was during the campaign. And I knew that he was, touting white supremacist lines because he came right out the gate on day one with, Mexicans as rapists and blah, blah, blah. They're not sending their best. So that wasn't even sort of dog whistled, that was more dog foghorned. And then this was also the guy who had been doing birtherism for the longest time. So that the white supremacist angle was very clear from the beginning. And the fact that he said it so baldly, and that media and people insisted on treating him either like he was a normal presidential candidate, and speaking of him in very, restrained tones. Well, oh gosh, this thing he said is kind of, unusual, isn't it? Or going too much the opposite way and treating him as a complete joke, who of course was not going to be allowed into the White House. Come on, don't be silly, or even into the as the Republican nominee. And so that was the first moment where I was like, uh-oh, we have a white supremacist. And rapidly after that, he began parroting what I have been taught by experts like Paxton to recognize as central features, not just of supremacy, but of fascism. Because there's a lot of, there's a lot of supremacist systems. There's been a lot of caste systems throughout history. But what makes, one of the things that makes fascism special, from what I can tell, is this myth of past glory, present decadence, and contamination by other elements, and then the planned rebirth of the society through purging those alien corrupting elements. That's kind of the myth of fascism. And when he started popping that up, and it's most centrally visible in Make America Great Again. When was America great? That's always been vague, but clearly it's not great now, and it needs to be made great again. And it needs to be made great again by doing things to these other people whose fault it is that it is not great. So then I was like, oh, okay, we're not just in KKK White Hood, that kind of territory here. We're straight up in Nazi territory And that's when I started trying to sound an alarm about that. And of course, when you sound the alarm, you get called alarmist. I would say that the moment where I got another big gut sock, maybe another technicolor moment, was when we were putting babies in cages and it didn't get stopped then. And I've always believed that a society is to be measured by how it treats its most vulnerable. And we've always talked in America a wonderful line about being in it for the children and caring about the children above all. And we've always been so terrible at actually keeping that promise. But this was just so writ large, so, so on the face of it, monstrous. And people again insisted on treating it like it wasn't the stop the world kind of thing that it should have been. And when that happened, I said, that's it. We've just passed a moral event horizon. We have just failed what future generations are going to regard as a simple test. They're not going to understand how we could ever have done this, and yet we just did it. And that was another moment that really brought home to me how dire a strait we were in and how close we were to the fascist collapse.
I think that's really helpful, because I think that I had a similar journey, I think, where during the campaign, I just had a sick feeling in my stomach, like, what is this? Why is this man? And I knew a little bit about Trump. I knew that he had called for the execution of the Central Park Five, these five youth who were framed, railroaded and proven innocent and released. And he never backed down from that. So I went from this sick feeling and to, the election. And then I really started to look for a framework for understanding this after the election. And honestly, the Refuse-Fascism original call to action, which came out which I saw before the inauguration, that helped me to start. And and then I started reading we've read some of the same books, like Anatomy of Fascism by Robert Paxton. And I'm going to talk a little bit, I dug up a few quotes from there, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. But I want to read what we have up at refusefascism.org. This is you can find it under About, and the very first question there is, what is fascism? And this is adapted from the call to action that was issued shortly after the Trump-Pence regime took power. Fascism has direction and momentum. Dissent is piece by piece criminalized. The truth is bludgeoned. Group after group is demonized and targeted along a trajectory that leads to real horrors. All of this has taken dramatic leaps under the Trump regime. History has shown that fascism must be stopped before it becomes too late. And then it goes on, fascism is not just a gross combination of horrific reactionary policies. It is a qualitative change in how society is governed. Fascism foments and relies on xenophobic nationalism, racism, misogyny, and the aggressive reinstitution of oppressive traditional values. And I think this is where the role of Mike Pence and the whole Christian fascist movement is really important. Fascist mobs and threats of violence are unleashed to build the movement and consolidate power. We've been seeing last week in Michigan, heavily armed, dressed in paramilitary garb, people storming the state capitol, and people, legislators there having to wear bulletproof vests, right? This is like fascist, armed, violent intimidation. What is crucial to understand is that once in power, fascism essentially eliminates traditional democratic rights. I think it's really important for people, in that definition, you also see kind of where there's a lot of fascism denial, because I think people take certain parts, like certain things that they have as a vision of what fascism is based on the end of Nazi Germany. And they're not looking at the whole picture. that the fact that it advances in stages, the fact that they forget that there are children in cages, that there are tens of thousands of immigrants in concentration camps, that, then he goes after Black women reporters, because it goes on to the next outrage, right? So you're always kind of like disoriented. But it's really important, I think, to have a big picture in mind of what fascism is, because it's coming down. It's a whole program that's coming down in what's in our statement of conscience, a daily barrage of insult and injury. So I was wondering, we were talking a little bit about right now, what's going on during this pandemic and these reopen rallies where supposedly, some people actually believe this lie that these people are out there standing up for economic rights or civil rights, when actually what they're doing is being called out to represent and advocate for this fascist movement, whether they know it or not. A lot of them do know it. I mean, there were people out there with Confederate flags and stuff. So I was wondering if you, in light of what I just read, and you were talking a little bit about Jason Stanley's book, the Sodom and Gomorrah chapter, can you talk a little bit about what you see going on with these rallies and how people should understand this as a fascist advance?
Right. I guess the way I'd like to come at it is, and you mentioned Jason Stanley's Sodom and Gomorrah chapter. This is in his book, How Fascism Works, which is it's a good short kind of 101, in which he also refers to a lot of other literature that you can read. And he titles the chapter Sodom and Gomorrah because what fascism is obsessed with is purity, right? This idea of purity, and that there is one people who are the pure people, and as long as they remain pure, then they will be covered in glory and protected by God, and basically nothing bad can happen. And it's only when you allow yourself to be contaminated by these foreign, decadent, subversive elements that you become vulnerable and human again. And that's why there's this obsession with raising the society out of its gutter into purity. And unfortunately, this maps pretty well not just onto ethno-fascism like Nazism and other ethno-fascisms, but also onto the Christo-fascism, especially in the US, where we have this very strong strain, Calvinist, the prosperity gospel strain, where basically if you're successful, it's because you did right by God. And if you're not successful, then that proves that you've displeased God. This is all in that same narrative. The virus becomes yet another stigma, a visible mark of whether you are pure or not. So they're playing, the fascists are playing with these people onto this conception that it's the cities, it's the urban people, it's the elites, it's the intellectuals, it's the gays, it's the minorities that are getting this virus, if there is indeed a virus. And they're probably just crying and hollering and trying to steal your money because it's what they do. But to the extent there is actually a virus and suffering, it is because they have incurred the displeasure of God, and allowed these foreign impure elements to come into their lives, right? And this is the city country distinction. This is Sodom and Gomorrah, the sinful city versus the pure countryside. When you hear of people speak of blood and soil, which was, as I recall, one of the chants at Charlottesville from those tiki torch fascists. That's a Nazi thing, but it's referring to a common fascist conception of, this mysticism of the people are the land, the people are the blood, the people are the leader. This is all glommed together into this thing that is blessed by virtue of being pure. And the cities are the antithesis of that. They are Sodom and Gomorrah. So when we talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. And the problem with this is that you reason backwards from your desired facts from your desired conclusion. Basically, they want to believe they are pure. They've been keeping what they see as the faith. Therefore, they should be safe, from the virus, if there even is a virus. They should be, they will be protected from it. They don't have to wear masks. They can go to church. In fact, church will be a prophylactic against the virus because it pleases God and God will protect them. This is the rhetoric that's in their heads. And the problem with that is it's pretty impervious to science and logic, because you've already decided it's a matter of you being pure. Ironically, there's a version of this on the left that is kind of starting to, the anti-vaxxers are supposedly starting to show up at these protests. And that also is a different form of obsession with purity, well, if you put only pure things in your body, then you won't get the virus, you'll be okay because you're pure. And I do worry about that overlap a lot. But basically with this, in asking me to explain the Sodom and Gomorrah concept, how that relates to fascism, that is how. It's this obsession with purity, with purification, with purging the unclean. And people who, by your definition, are unclean, you can't help them. They're going to be smote down anyway. So why worry about that?
Thank you. I'm going to pass it back to Samantha for a little bit, and then I want to pick back up on this.
Thank you. If you appreciate what you've heard so far, keep watching, and don't just keep watching, share this, okay? If you just joined, you have good friends, okay? Thank them for sharing this with you. This is Inside with Out Now. It's a regular live brought to you by volunteers with the Refuse Fascism movement, refusefascism.org. Refuse Fascism is a movement of people coming from diverse perspectives, united in the recognition that the Trump-Pence regime poses catastrophic danger to humanity and the planet itself, and must be driven from power through sustained mass protests. And I wanted to take just a moment to give people a way to act. If you've been listening to this and you appreciate that there is a force that is demanding the immediate removal of this regime, a force that is calling it what it is, we call on you to join us. Coco mentioned and read from this statement of conscience and call to act. I encourage everyone after this live is over to go and read it in full, discuss it, debate it, share it, add your name and spread it. And very importantly, to donate. I made a little card, where did I put it? To donate, refusefascism.org or Venmo, refuse-fascism. If you appreciate being able to have dialogues like this and being able to see a movement in real life and online that refuses to back down and is organizing for a time where we can have the mass sustained nonviolent protests needed to remove this regime, then I encourage you to donate generously. Later, I'm hoping to show a photo, probably towards the end, of what Coco mentioned about the protests that happened here in Philly. But we disrupted and blocked this fascist mob and brought out, science, not ignorance, humanity, not me, reopen equals death, Trump, Pence, out now. And in doing so, we got ticketed. We have over $300 of traffic violations. If you think that it's worth it to get out this demand, Trump, Pence, out now more than ever, donate, refusefascism.org, Venmo-refusefascism. Keep spreading this live. We're having conversation with Sarah Roark and Coco Das, members of the refusefascism.org editorial board, on this American fascism. What is it? and what's required. So I'm going to pass it back to Coco. Thanks so much.
Thanks. So I have a couple of other things I want to talk about. I hope that people are commenting. Maybe we can hear some, if there are some questions in a little bit. But I want to pick up again about, I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about this, this call to the past, of this mythic past, this pure past, and the Calvinist strain of that here in the Christian theocracy, the Christian fascism that's made it all the way up to the highest levels of office, right? And are actually destroying separation of church and state, and actually like pushing a theocratic agenda where women lose the right to abortion, birth control. LGBT people are pushed back into the closet, that this is being pushed all the way up into the Supreme Court, right? I wanted to read a quote from Anatomy of Fascism, which is an older book. I think it came out in the 90s, if I'm not. So I think it's important to have a range of resources. So this is one of the older ones that really studies European fascism. But there are some things in it that I learned a lot from. And one of the quotes here is that fascisms seek out in each national culture those themes that are best capable of mobilizing a mass movement of regeneration, unification, and purity, directed against liberal individualism and constitutionalism, and against leftist class struggle. So this is what was, the main the thing in the rise of fascism in Europe in the 20th century. I think there are ways in which it's morphed a little bit, but I think that this is definitely a central feature of fascism that has continued to this day. So it's really important for people to understand that, there is a general definition of fascism, and then there are ways in each country where it manifests. And there's even a quote in this book where I can't find it right now, but where he says what might seem ridiculous to another group of fascists about like that group's national fascism makes perfect logical sense in that. So for example, in India, there's a rise of a Hindu fascist movement with the government of Modi, and vegetarianism is a big part of that. And Muslims have been lynched for, the suspicion of eating beef or selling beef or having beef. Here, that seemed, an American fascist generally isn't going to be that concerned about whether someone's a vegetarian or a meat eater, but there, that's the feature of the cultural, that's the cultural aspect of it there. What are some other resources that you use for understanding fascism? And I guess one more thing I want to say is for this American fascism, at refusefascism.org, we do have many resources for understanding it. And one of them is a video that we've had different clips of it, and we've had the whole video, but it is the video by a speech given by Bob Avakian in 2018, I think, or 27, it was in 2017, called in the Name of Humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. The Trump-Pence regime must go. Another world is possible. So that really traces, there's a line in it that there's a direct line from the Confederacy to the fascists of today. And it really traces much more than like Robert Paxton could in the 1990s, because he wrote this before this movement really rose to power. Some of what is unique about this American fascism, but what are some of the resources that you've used to understand fascism as a whole?
Well, boy, did you just serve me a cornucopia that to sample from? And as always, I want to hear like your answer to the same question, but you have to kind of come at it from different ways, because nobody's really, I don't think, written the book on American fascism yet. I think that, you know, assuming that we all survive to get more history books after this, whatever this turns out to be, there will be a book on the American flavor of fascism, because as you point out, Robert Paxton has said that fascism, you know, it has common elements across different countries. And as I said, what I look for, what I really tag for, is that circular myth of the past glory, the future glory, the present, the debauched, degraded, humiliated present. That's the other thing. Everybody's laughing at us. That's a very Trump thing, and it's also a Hitler thing. Everybody's laughing at us and taking advantage of us. They think we're suckers.
The
well,
false
guess what?
victimhood, yeah.
Right, we're not going to be suckers no more, you know. So, but within that, as he said, each fascism takes elements from its own culture that resonate with people emotionally. So you're not going to see, for the most part, swastikas in an American fascism. You know, you're going to see American flags. I can't remember whose quote it is, that when fascism comes to America, it will be wrapped in the American flag. But that's the thing. An American fascism is most likely to dig into what people here have traditionally drilled down into emotionally, which is Christian, and is also, you know, the stars and stripes, the American exceptionalism, the machismo. Machismo was certainly in other fascisms as well. We have our own special brand of it that's attached to our guns and our arsenal and everything. So that's going to be in there too. It's going to be a mix that makes sense, as you said, to the people of that particular country. But that's all, but that is skinny. That's all just the way that you sell that fascist myth, that circular fascist myth, to a particular people. It's still fascism. You don't have to have jackboots. You don't have to have swastikas. As you pointed out, Modi's Hindu fascism, which is absolutely ethno-religious fascism, it has a very different flavor. And yet it is 100% fascism. It all the boxes for fascism itself are ticked. But you can be in an argument with somebody politically, and I've seen them pop up on your Twitter feed of, but no, this can't be fascism. I mean, you know, they're vegetarians, for heaven's sakes, you know, and this is not about that. This is about other things. It's about anti-colonialism. It's about you know, not being invaded by terrible Muslims. It's not Nazism. Come on. But that's exactly the point. It's crafted to make sense to the majority in that country. Ours is crafted to make sense to ours. So that's how that's going to work.
Well, I'd like to read a couple of the comments, I mean, some of my resources are I actually really am interested right now in how people are starting to understand this as fascism. So this isn't really a resource, but I was listening to the Mehdi Hassan Deconstructed podcast yesterday, and there was a woman who was a expert, has been studying like these right-wing groups for you know, a long time, and so it was very interesting to hear how she was talking about it. But I have a little bit more to say on that in terms of fascism denialism. But I want to read a few of the comments. One person commented that the US has been heading towards fascism for decades. And I think that's true. And even Paxton talks about how fascism, there are different stages. There's the stage where they're building the movement. Then there's a stage where they rise to power. And then, you know, there's a final stage where he calls it radicalization, where that's where you're really headed towards a genocide. But yeah, I think we both agree that that's true. And I think there's a question there is like, when was the right time to stop it? And you've talked about how at different points it becomes harder to stop it. Not impossible, but harder. And,
Yeah.
I think when this pandemic came down, we reached a point where mass protest, the possibility of that, which was our best shot at driving out the regime that is actually escalating this fascism, that was sort of shut down, although people are protesting, as the people in Philly, they went out with masks on, socially distancing. But the possibility of mass protest, of millions of people in the streets, that's shut down right now. It's not what we are organizing for at this moment. Somebody also asked, is there a way for people to start mass protests safely, to get out there and take a stand against the fascist regime? Nurses did protest at the White House, and that was actually, that was a really beautiful scene, where they put shoes down for the nurses who had died. And they with pairs of shoes. Yeah. So I wonder if you have some thoughts on that.
Oh, always. But I just realized I forgot to put in the actual book recommendations part of my answer to you. And we can get to that, the book recommendations whenever you want. We could do it in a list. But in reference to because I realized the point that I'd been heading for is that you have to take a little bit of a multidisciplinary approach, because the book on American fascism hasn't been written yet. So I read books on fascism in different countries, and I read books on America's issues that are fascistic or pre-fascist. And, I read political science, I read economics, I read all kinds of things, because that book doesn't exist yet. So we can talk about those book recommendations later. The one I'd like to start off this answer with is Zeynep Tufekci, Turkish academic who has written a book called Twitter and Tear Gas about protest in the modern era, where she talks about the logistics and the power dynamics of mass protests like Gezi Park in Turkey, or Occupy Wall Street, or various successful and non-successful mass movements, and why they worked and why they didn't, and how especially the mechanics of it have changed in the modern era with social media and everything. And I would say that there are cycles of too late. It's never permanently too late. As long as there are people alive, you can do something. Even Hitler eventually was defeated. It's just, but there's a valid question of how many millions of lives could we have saved if people had stopped him earlier? And there were multiple places where people should have seen it and should have stopped it while it was relatively quote unquote easy. We're having the same problem in the States. For the last 3 years, it's been quote unquote too hard to remove Trump-Pence nonviolently from office. Well, now there's a pandemic, and what you thought was too hard earlier looks like a walk in the park, which is not to say that new windows won't open. They absolutely will. I think there are shifts in consciousness happening right now in this pandemic moment that ironically are giving people the mentality they need at a time when physically it is harder to protest. The other big problem we have, this is me being super frank here, is that a normal Arab Spring type Velvet Revolution protest, where you remove a leader from power by nonviolent protest, or in South Korea in 2016 when they removed Park. That kind of thing relies on shutting down business as usual. Basically, you are sending a message to your politicians who've been ignoring the oppression and the will of the people and the decay of democracy. And you're saying to them, look, we're putting the brakes on all of this, and you cannot get back to your comfortable bubble lives of power until you do right by us. And under normal circumstances, politicians will be like, God, nobody's bringing me food, nobody's emptying my garbage, I can't do my, I can't do my job, I can't, everything is on hold until I finally shut up and listen to the people. And then they do. The problem is that under this pandemic, business as usual is already shut down. The virus forced the issue. And so we are without a lot of leverage that we would normally have. That's just the fact. And that was destined to happen, which is exactly why Refuse-Fascism has spent the last 3 years begging people to not wait until it was going to be too hard, to do it while that power was still openly available to us. It will be openly available to us again. And the more people wake up, the more options there are. And we are finding ways to COVID-safe protest, COVID-safe raise awareness, COVID-safe counter-protest these conspiracy theories and anti-science people who are killing people with their ignorance. We are finding ways to do this, but you know, I would be being dishonest if I said that it is going to be as easy now as it would have been if we'd done it when we should have in 2017. It's not, but that's not an excuse. We can always free our minds, and we can do more physically. We can always do more physically than we thought we could. That was true in 2017. It's true now. And we can also ready ourselves for the time when there isn't a lockdown. And the need to remove this regime will be even stronger than it ever was. It's not going to go away. It's going to continue until they're actually out. And they're not planning to go out in November.
When people see the necessity and when they have the consciousness, I think people find a way. And I mean,
yes.
I think you can see that people have found a way to protest. And what if people, you know, took miles and miles of a city to standing 6 feet apart with signs? You know, I think there are lots of possibilities of what could happen. I wanted to check in with Sam and see if she wants to come on and say anything. I do want to talk about fascism denial and some of the ways that maybe we can take that on, but I know we're coming up on time, so.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to say a couple of things. Again, for those of you who are just joining, this is Inside with Out Now. It's a regular live brought to you by volunteers with Refuse-Fascism. Refuse-Fascism is a movement of people who come from diverse perspectives, united in the recognition that the Trump-Pence regime pose catastrophic danger to humanity and the planet and need to be driven from power. And I wanted to start by saying thank you to Jay in California for donating $25 via Venmo. I hope that more people will join Jay, match Jay's $25 donation. We have $304 of parking tickets not parking, traffic violations, excuse me, for courageous protesters that went out today and said, no, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. Trump, Pence, out now. So you can go and do that. I wanted to quickly show, if it's all right. Is that all right to show something really quick? All right, let's see. I think. So I just wanted to show quickly, this is a photo of the Washington Post piece, and that's a photo from today's action. And so people should comment on this. Refuse-Fascism is not quitting, to be clear. We are going out and organizing to drive out a regime that imperils humanity and the planet itself, that is only been shown to be more dangerous than ever in light of this COVID-19 pandemic. So I encourage people to go and support Refuse-Fascism in taking actions in real life and online to stop this American fascism before it becomes too late. And two of the most important ways to do it is, one is donating, and the other is reading, signing, and spreading the statement of conscience, which is available at refusefascism.org. And I said there was 2 things, but there are 3. Follow us on social media at Refuse Fascism, and that way you can see what is this movement doing, along with analysis, and be part of joining with people from around the country who refuse to accept a fascist America. One of the things I know that Coco is going to talk about, fascist denialism, right? But one thing that has continued to strike me, and I would love your thoughts on, both of you, is you see the shredding of the norms. You see, him attacking people that disagree with him. And then, anybody who's loyal to him gets defended, and you can see these clear signs of a fascist regime, whether it's, the attacks on the rule of law, the continuation of lock her up, who her is changes, but the sentiment stays the same. His opponents, the unprecedented attacks on whole sections of people, the Christian fascists in the judiciary, the anti-science, all of that. And then people still will say, well, we've got November. And I don't know if people don't get or are willfully denying that once this gets consolidated, this being fascism, it closes off the ability for anyone inside or outside the halls of power to challenge or stop them. And I think I would like to hear your thoughts on, how do we help people confront this and act accordingly with this fascist denialism?
Coco, your engine is revved. You go first.
So, first I want to say that there's an article also on our homepage that was originally from RevCom called Fascism Denialism is as Dangerous as Climate Denialism, and it's a very important read. And yeah, there does come a point where it becomes too late to actually stop millions of people from being harmed once the regime consolidates power. We are sort of in a race for time. And so it is really important that we really confront people on understanding that you have to step out of normal channels to stop this fascism. And so, just exactly on the lines that Sam was talking about yesterday, and not to call this out, I really like this podcast, Deconstructed, with Mehdi Hassan, and he was interviewing somebody, and I can't remember her name right now, but they had a really rich discussion, used the word fascistic, talked about how Trump might not step down if he loses the election. And where I was listening really closely, and where he asked 2 questions, and there was a crucial question he did not ask. And I'm starting to think that this is a big part of where this fascism denialism lies, and how we need to break through to the other side. The 2 questions he asked were, what should the media be doing? Because the media has been complicit, right? And what should the Democrats do? After saying that there wasn't that much that the Democrats could do. But the question he did not ask was, what should we do? And it just really struck me that a lot of this denialism is to get out of that question, what do we do? What should we do? And looking for the savior that in these norms that are being shredded, these people who are being demonized. I got a tweet saying that the Democrats are the democrats, right? These people, this like the extreme end of this base, which is very activated, actually believes that the opposition is possessed, by demons. So this is not a movement that's just going to go away. through an election, right? So I think that is one way that I just kind of been, and I'm speaking for myself here, but just constantly saying, what are you going to do about this? Sarah, you raised this point that what we allow is not what we condone, it's what we become. You're becoming somebody by waiting for November. And is that the person you want to become? And I think we do have to help people follow their own logic. You've got and I've been listening to this podcast for a while, and he's come a long way to even say that this is fascistic. But now, okay, follow your logic to the next step. And I think that's, and another thing is, I guess I want to also throw this out, is where, you have fascism denialism from the fascists themselves, right? And they'll say like, you're the fascists, or, they'll call me names and stuff. And I sort of think when that happens, like on Twitter, or if you're out in the street, you're answering them more for the audience, right? Like for people who get confused when fascists say the Democrats are being fascist because they're shutting down the economy. You have to answer that, not for them, because you're not going to convince them, but for the people who are listening. But then there's all the denialism among the people who really are on the side of humanity and are just, stuck in a line of thinking that is actually taking them down a road to complicity. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on like how you handle that, or what you think. Have you had any epiphanies lately?
No, I mean, like not completely new epiphanies. I see the process continuing. That's been continuing, which is part of why I wrote that Drinks at Sobibor piece, which was really about that you can become something that you didn't mean to be. There, the book recommendation I would like to make is They Thought They Were Free. And oh gosh, I think the last name of the author is Mayer, Mayer, who is this is just post-war. He's a Jewish scholar who went to Germany and befriended these various guys who had been in the Nazi party, some of them because they were Nazis, some because they didn't want to get shot, and befriended them. They didn't know he was Jewish. He didn't volunteer the information. So he got really quite intimate conversations and confessions from these men. And one of them, who was an engineer and very thoughtful, explained that because everybody at that time after the war was asking, how did this happen? Germans are not, they're not apes, they're not savages. How did this all become possible in a civilized country? And in fact, in one of the countries which was up to then considered one of the friendliest countries for Jews and sexual minorities and other people. And he said, well, it doesn't just happen in all one step. You don't go from step A to step E. It comes in stages, and if you didn't resist at stage B, then why should you resist at stage C? And if you didn't do anything at stage C, then what's one more stage? And then suddenly one day you're hearing your small child say death to Jew swine, and you realize that you've allowed this monstrosity to happen right under your nose. I'm paraphrasing him, but that was basically what he said. What he said was that you can become somebody you didn't intend to be by your inaction and by remaining in an environment that's becoming more and more poisonous and not questioning it and not resisting it. And that was why he counted himself as guilty, even though his joining the Nazi party was just to keep his job. So that's, I found that very powerful. And that's, I think, what a lot of the denialism is about. I've been at presentations where people have straight up said to me, if you pin them down, they will say this. Well, the problem is, if I agreed with you that it was fascism, then I would have to do something about it. Then I would need to do something radical about it. And I'm like, okay, so you just reason backwards from your desired conclusion. You don't want to do that. so it must not be fascism. That's not okay. And
No.
there I will agree with Bob Avakian here. By the way, I do want to put in the caveat for folks watching that I am not personally a communist of any kind, including a RCP communist. There are points on which I don't agree with Bob Avakian, and especially as a sort of mainstreamish Democrat, sometimes his criticisms of the party are fair, sometimes they are not. But I would encourage people, even in my sector of politics, which was considered wild and out there in the 90s and is no longer considered out there. It's very mainstream now. Open your mind and listen to people whose ideologies are different from yours. If their base principles are where they need to be, that humanity is human, all humans are humanity. Humanity has to come first. The planet has to survive. Science is a thing. These basic principles, if they're there for them, and Bob Avakian is there for those principles, listen to what he has to say. You don't have to agree with all of it, but there are, the reason that he is quoted in some of these materials is that he has a point. And one of those points he makes is that you can't reason backwards from what you wanted to do anyway to what the facts are. You don't get to do that. The facts have to be what the facts are, and you have to proceed from them. And you don't get to make them up. You get your own opinions, but you don't get your own facts, as the proverb says.
I think this is really important, and I think we'll probably have to end on this, but we don't have to agree on everything, but if you agree that the future of humanity and the planet is worth saving, and that this regime is a blocking issue for anything good that any of us want, then join us and let's make a united front under this this demand. Trump, Pence must go.
Yes.
And we don't have to agree. We can argue it out in
Yes.
the streets as we're working non-violently, or we can, virtually right now. But join us and really let's dig into what it is that is holding people back, and how do we help with our arms wide open, welcome them into this this really just cause that is historic. So with that, I want to say I love talking to you, Sarah. We need to do this more often, and I'm going to pass it back to Samantha. Thank you.
Always, Coco.
I don't want to add any more words. That was a really important way to end this. I just want to add, let's continue this discussion. Let's share this live, continue to share it, continue to discuss with your friends and family and neighbors what was brought up in this live and what is in the Refuse Fascism Statement of Conscience and Call to Act. Go to refusefascism.org, read it, share it, sign it, and donate to make it a force in the world. Refusefascism.org. You can donate there, and at Venmo, refuse-fascism. We need to stay safe, not silent. Trump, Pence, out now.
Now.
Thank you both for joining. See you soon.
Bye.
Yep. Here.